back on the Zero Hour. I am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. As we record these words on Thursday, the Republicans still have not chosen a Speaker of the House, but whatever the outcome of that drama is, we know that legislative action will be extremely difficult for President Biden and the Democratic Party in the next 2 years, since they will be able to get very little through the House. With that in mind, my next guest has written, since actually before the Biden administration began, on the ability of a president, in this case Biden, to take executive action for progressive purposes. He has resurfaced that topic in a piece he published recently, executive actions that the president might take during the next 2 years of gridlock in Congress. David Dayen is the executive editor of the American Prospect. He's the author of Chain of Title, How Three Ordinary Americans Uncovered Wall Street's Great Foreclosure Fraud and Monopolized Life in the Age of Corporate Power. And he joins us now. So first of all, David Dayen, thanks for coming back on the program.
Thanks for having me.
So you're normally, when I interview a writer, I say that, the headline and subheading, they might not have picked, but you're the editor as well as the author of this piece. So bearing in mind that, you had some input here, your subhead, your headline 2023, a year for executive action, subheading, legislative process will take a back seat in the next couple of years. The executive branch will have to implement the Biden agenda on its own. You've drawn a lot for this piece, and you reference in this piece the work that you guys have done over the last couple of years or so in outlining possible executive actions. There is, without sounding, mundane about it, there are a lot of things the president can do without Congress, right?
Yeah, I think this week and the contrast between what is happening on Capitol Hill and what is happening elsewhere couldn't be more stark. Whereas on Capitol Hill, there's a lot of finger pointing and yelling and gridlock and insanity and chaos. Elsewhere, this has actually been an extraordinary week for governing. Think about what has happened just in this first week of 2023. The FDA has decided to allow mifepristone, which is one of the abortion medications, to be sold in pharmacies, which is a tremendous move forward for abortion access. Separately, the Justice Department said in a legal ruling that the Postal Service can send that pill through the mail, even to red states. An absolute sea change in abortion access, and something that's been asked for by advocates for years and years and years. Separately, the banking regulators gave a guidance to the largest banks in the country, saying that including cryptocurrency in their portfolios would represent a risk to the safety and soundness of their banking operations. While they didn't say crypto is banned from your portfolios, they certainly intimated that it would be a bad thing for safety and soundness to have those assets as part of your portfolio. And this, by the way, is why the crypto collapse has not spread out into the broader financial system and the broader economy. It has been confined. And that's a regulatory decision and a regulatory victory. And then the Federal Trade Commission comes out with a proposed rule to ban the use of non-compete agreements. These are these agreements that are put into employment contracts that say, if you're a fast food worker and you work on one side of the street, you can't go to the fast food chain on the other side of the street. This is a clear wage suppression tactic. The FTC estimates that this costs workers $300 billion a year, and they've put out a proposal to ban it. And so this is the actual work of government. governance that is happening at the same time that there's this ridiculousness happening on Capitol Hill. And it proves the point that I was making, when I wrote this piece before any of this happened, that what 2023 is going to be characterized by and where the Biden presidency will rise or fall is on whether or not they can continue this momentum and make good decisions on executive action. All of the things I described are based on previous authorities given to these executive agencies by Congress. There are a number of other laws that were passed in the first 2 years of the Biden administration. All of those have to be implemented. And if they're implemented smartly and correctly, we'll see real change in this country. And if they're not implemented correctly, if they are beholden to corporate interests or they water down their proposals, then we will not see that change that we could otherwise. And so this really is what I think should be. It's going to be the main focus of my work and of the work at the American Prospect. And I think it should be so more broadly.
And of course, if what you say is true, and it makes a lot of sense, it should also be a major focus of activism, that the White House becomes the point, the focal point for activist and movement groups. So that is, I think, very, very important. I guess I would start with this. You sort of try to read an administration's, we all do, I think, to one extent or another, state of mind, approach towards governance and so on. And I might be wrong, but it's my sense that the Biden White House has shifted somewhat. I mean, first of all, when he was elected, there was an assumption that this was, longtime Senate guy, get along to go along, or whatever that saying is, would, try to wheel and deal on the Hill with his friends in both parties, quote unquote. But it seemed he started out with a certain moderate level of openness to executive action, and that gradually stiffened or strengthened over the first 2 years, especially with his executive action on student debt. I felt that was a turning point. And it seems to me, what I'm wondering now, particularly with what you're describing, is whether the loss of the House will ratchet that up even more in terms of their willingness to take actions that they might have rather deferred to Congress in the first 2 years.
Right. Well, we saw this dynamic under Obama as well. In the first 2 years, he had no interest in executive action or those kinds of decisions. And he would even say, there's nothing I can do on Dreamers except through the passing of legislation. And then as Congress went into the hands of Republicans and there was no outlet for any kind of immigration reform, he went ahead and put the DACA rule in place and did an executive order to protect Dreamers. So this is a familiar tactic that you start out with these high-minded ideas of bipartisan solutions and a broad legislative agenda, and then you see that completely stalled. But you want to make progress in some way or another, and so you use the authorities given to you already to try to forward your agenda through. And so this is not really that surprising. I think the Biden administration has actually had executive action in their minds to a much greater degree than the Obama administration did. I mean, the student debt action comes while Biden holds the House and the Senate, right?
Right.
So I think that they have had an awareness, and certainly, no administration is a monolith, but there are many people within the administration who really believe in the idea of maximizing the potential and the powers of the office and using the existing laws that are sitting there to make tangible benefits for the American people. And so I think the student loan order is a good example of that. Obviously, it's tied up in the courts now. The administration just dropped their brief in that case, which will be heard in oral arguments on February 28th. They think they have a real shot of winning at the Supreme Court, which could surprise people. But we'll see what happens with that. in June. In the meantime, the payments have been paused throughout the entire Biden presidency and will until the adjudication of that student loan order. And that in and of itself is a massive savings for millions and millions of borrowers.
Yes, and David Dayen, you made a point, your point about a lot of people, not everyone perhaps, but a lot of people in the administration believing in government as a force for good is actually a good segue to the next topic I wanted to bring up with you in the context of executive action, and that's personnel. That's hiring. Not everybody hired by this administration has been someone that I personally have cheered, but Lena Khan at the FTC is not only a great choice, but a great statement, I would say, about monopolies and tech. You mentioned in your January 2nd piece about executive action, you mentioned Gary Gensler, who is SEC chair, who says that laws are already on the books to address the crypto issue. So in terms of personnel, I guess the good news is, I would think, but tell me if I'm wrong, that with a couple more Senate seats, the Democrats, in addition to perhaps being a judicial confirmation factory, as openings come up, this administration, if it chooses to, can appoint people who will be more ambitious in terms of executive action. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that Democrats retain the Senate and therefore the ability to continue to confirm appointees to the executive branch as well as judges is extremely important, and that they have a one vote cushion now relative to the previous Congress means that someone like Joe Manchin can't just block every energy appointment by himself. So that is obviously critical. The Biden administration is currently renominating a lot of the folks that didn't get through in the last Congress. I would point you to one in particular, and that is Gigi Sohn. She would be the fifth member of the Federal Communications Commission. In the entire Biden administration thus far, there's been a 2-2 deadlock on the Federal Communications Commission because they have blocked the appointment of Gigi Sohn. This means that, for example, net neutrality restrictions cannot be put back in place because Republicans don't agree with that. And so there's been this deadlock here. If Sohn were to get on the board, I would expect in short order to see a restoration of the net neutrality protections put back into place. And that, what those mean, by the way, is that internet service providers can't throttle the content of websites based on a whim or based on a toll that they get from one website or another. They can't favor any content over another. It's a common carrier restriction. So I think Sohn is a good example of, if you put somebody in place, something's going to happen, and something pretty important, I think, is going to happen.
And you mentioned a category of government appointee you call unheralded people. And I've always been interested in, and as you know, there are activist groups who maintain databases of smart, progressive talent that could serve in these sort of middle management positions. If they're very senior, but in terms of the federal government, they might be considered middle management. You mentioned Gabe Klein, who runs the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation. Klein will manage $7.5 billion, which ain't nothing, in electric vehicle charging station funds. That's actually, to me, that's a huge thing, because it seems to me that a lot of the, what I would call the, and probably you, undoubtedly you do, the pernicious influence of large corporate money in the economy sometimes gets exercised in these corners of the government. For example, somebody, it might be that if the wrong person were in Gabe Klein's position, a lot of this money would go to Tesla or some other charging station that might not be compatible with all vehicles, or might help reinforce some sort of monopolistic position of a corporation, and so on.
Well, let me stop you there, because I'll explain to you exactly what was done on exactly the point you make, RJ. So this is a $7.5 billion pot of money to start a nationwide vehicle charging network around the country. And as you correctly state, there are proprietary versions of this at different automakers. So the Tesla charger is not compatible with the charger for a Chevy Volt, for example. And this is a problem. If you want to do a nationwide charging network, you need interoperability, so that just like if you go to a gas station, there's not a Toyota gas station and a Honda gas station, but any gas station you go to, you can fill your tank and right, get the power you need to go through. So what they did is they said, on this $7.5 billion of money, if you want to access it for your vehicles, you have to make them interoperable. You have to make the chargers that way. And Tesla, which was the main holdout to this interoperability idea, they had a proprietary network, and they also had proprietary software, so that you couldn't use a Tesla charger if you didn't have the right software in your vehicle. They said they would change all that as a condition of getting the money to build out their charging network. So that's a little thing, a little standards piece that now will create a charging network that anyone can use anywhere across the country. So it's a perfect example of this. This didn't get a ton of headlines, right? But it's a perfect example of stopping incipient monopolization, as you talk about, and exclusionary conduct from the likes of Tesla. And so I think that's a perfect example of what I'm talking about.
And the implications for that, Dave, are so broad, because literally just yesterday I was talking to a relative, one car family, and they just bought a new car. They bought a hybrid. He said they would have bought an EV, but they come down to this part of to the DC area fairly regularly, and they didn't feel comfortable that any one vehicle, would get them here without having difficulty finding recharging along the way. Yeah. So therefore, it not only opens up the field in the sense of fair competition for all manufacturers, but broadens the adoption of electric vehicles, which is what we want for the environment. So a great example. You also mentioned Jigar Shah, who runs the loan programs office at the Department of Energy. Shah has up to $100 billion to loan for green energy projects. As you say, that will matter more in the overall scheme this year than Marjorie Taylor Greene or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. So that basically, again, that's a lot of money that could go to large corporations, to monopolies, or it could go to projects that not only help new and perhaps more equitable socially and economically, newer companies thrive, but could also resist monopoly, right? So this is maybe put more people to work, maybe at better wages, maybe if...
I mean, this is the same office that actually gave loans infamously to Solyndra after the financial crisis. There was this money to do moonshots to improve clean energy across the country. Solyndra was one. Those loans failed. It also gave loans, by the way, to Tesla, and that succeeded and helped the cause of electric vehicle take-up. So this now, they haven't made any loans since, I think, 2011. So now they have this huge new pot of money given to them by the Inflation Reduction Act to continue these. And it's really almost a venture capital operation inside the federal government, giving this ability for startup organizations to get seed capital on, moonshot projects, things that we don't know about right now that might be the linchpin of our energy future, right? And you have to have somebody willing to do that. Private banks are probably not going to do that. It's too speculative. It's too risky. It just might not get the returns that they want. But the government now has said, we're in the business. We need this for the environment. We need this for homegrown industry, and we're going to put this forward. And so the success or failure and the willingness to fail, right? The willingness to take risks in getting to a place where we find that killer app for clean energy is going to be really, really important. And so Jigar Shah, I think, is a monumental figure right now in terms of his ability to get this money out the door.
And, as a long-time observer of this stuff, as am I can only say for myself that I've tended to have a sort of developed a knee-jerk negative initial reaction to government programs that act as venture funds or startup because of the way I've seen the money dispersed by past administrations and how I've seen that often work against the public interest or develop something that is in the public interest, but then place it in the hands of people who abuse it. So certainly my hope, based on what I'm reading from and hearing from you, Dave, is that people like Klein and Shah will be able to really make these programs work for the public. The next subject I wanted to talk to you about regarding this is activism. Those of us with an activist bent, want to use every opportunity we can to pressure the government to do the right thing, inspire the government, whatever, whatever term you want to use, whether it's on climate or economic justice, racial justice, what have you. And you mentioned at least one, perhaps more, but at least one victory, what I would argue is a victory for activism, for organizing, and that's the U.S. Postal Service. Mm-hmm. So tell us about that, if you would.
So, yeah, I mean, it starts with what I would characterize as not a victory, the fact that Louis DeJoy, who was a Trump-selected Postmaster General, is still in place 2 years after Joe Biden became president. But his initial plan for greening but replacing the postal vehicle fleet, which is the largest portion of the federal vehicle fleet, did not include hardly any electric vehicles. He was going to do this project with a contract with a company called Oshkosh Defense, which was based in Wisconsin, but the plant that they would do this at is a non-union plant in South Carolina. And almost all of the vehicles would have been internal combustion engines, getting as little as 8 miles to a gallon. And this obviously was at odds with the president's conception of how to help with climate change by taking the largest portion of the American vehicle fleet, the public government vehicle fleet, and making sure it's renewable. And so he agitated for it, and activists, as you say, agitated, said we got to change this. And now the Postal Service changed their order, and their order is now up to 75% of the fleet they'll be getting being electric, and 100% after 2026. They get them in stages. So at any stage after 2026, all those vehicles will be electric. So that's a big win. They didn't move the production facility of the vehicles from the non-union plant in South Carolina to the unionized plant in Wisconsin. So there's still work to do here. Mm-hmm. And that shows that this success doesn't necessarily always happen in a straight line, right? Right. Another example that I mentioned in the piece is about the fact that the use of funding tax credits for carbon capture systems, which is something that's in the Inflation Reduction Act, which is a carbon neutral process, says anything that benefits from a carbon standpoint is eligible for tax credits. So carbon capture, which is a little bit controversial, was one of the things that was put forward. But the definition, once the rules were written, because the legislature makes the rules or they write the laws, and then the rules themselves, the specifics, get put in place by the executive branch, which executes the laws. And the Department of Energy, when it did that, said that carbon capture could be used for, I believe the term is enhanced oil recovery. And what that means is using this process of carbon capture to essentially suck as much oil out of a dormant drilling facility as you possibly could. And the idea that you're extracting that oil a little bit more cleanly, but you otherwise wouldn't be able to extract that oil. So the idea that this is a benefit from a carbon standpoint is very dubious. However, that is the way that they did it. And so, you have this thing in the Inflation Reduction Act was designed to lower greenhouse gas emissions that is going to increase the exploration and extraction of oil in this particular instance. So, this doesn't happen in a straight line. That's why we got to be vigilant, and activists as well have to watch what is happening and call out things, because even when decisions are made, like in the case of the Postal Service, there's an opportunity to change that decision after the fact.
And that's an excellent point. Vigilance, price of liberty is eternal vigilance. But it's also interesting. I've been looking at the American Prospects Executive Tracker, and it's interesting, which is at prospect.org. It's interesting how the red blocks, which indicate there's been no executive action, most of them, I think. Not all of them, but many or most of them are around nuclear war, for example, or other military-related issues.
Right.
No first use of nuclear weapons is a no. Biden is continuing the longstanding policy of not pledging no first use of nuclear weapons. Canceling or suspending development, production, and deployment of new nuclear weapons is a no. And there was one other. They did. Yes, of course. How could I forget? They would not re-sign the Open Skies Treaty, which which I guess Trump took the first move towards withdrawing from, and then Russia formally withdrew, made it official in June of 2021. So but it seems to me what's interesting about that, disturbing to me personally, very worrisome, but what's interesting to me is that kind of tracks with a sense that activism does work sometimes with this administration, because there's one area where there's been very little activism compared to, say, the 1980s or the 1960s, when there was peace movements and so on. There are strong individual voices and organizational voices against a new Cold War and so on, but there hasn't been the kind of mass movement there has been around environment, where some good things have been done, or health, or student debt. Student debt was a huge organizing issue. So to me, that's almost, with that negative, it kind of affirms the idea that maybe not to the extent that all of us would like, but it is possible to move this administration into executive action through activism. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think that certainly we've not just the nuclear freeze movement, but foreign policy more generally and military policy more generally has gotten less of a interest from the progressive movement broadly. Whether you're talking about anti-war or just militarization more generally, and so it's a signal, I think, to people who are interested in that they need to be more attentive and get with those groups, whether they're dormant or just lacking resources, and get them involved in this, because it can work, as you say. And yeah, I think that's important.
Yeah, it's a little bit, having worked with a lot of those people, I can tell you it's a little bit more of a challenge when people are lighting votive candles to James Comey or Robert Mueller, but it can be done, I suppose, and it is a message. So, David Dayen, before I let you go, 2023 is already an interesting year. So what can people interested in activism and interested in getting the kind of executive action progressives want, what should they be doing? I assume first on the list is reading the American Prospect. And you do have this tracker. You're going to keep maintaining it. And
yeah, absolutely. I think a perfect example is something I talked about at the beginning, which was this proposed rule on non-compete agreements, which will have this huge impact for workers. Like every rule, because this is the way administrative procedure works, there's a notice of proposed rulemaking and there's a public comment period that gets done after that point. And those comments are actually read, I can tell you from talking to the regulators. And then they propose a final rule based, in part on those comments. And usually that public comment phase is dominated by lobbyists and trade groups. And that's who makes the comments, right? We had an interesting counter to that when public comment went out to change the merger guidelines at the Department of Justice and the Federal Trade Commission. Some groups organized to get real ordinary people to talk about the impact of monopolization on their lives and make comments on what they'd like to see out of those mergers. And 5,000 comments were delivered to the DOJ and the FTC, which was a record for merger guidelines of this kind. So there's a public comment period opening for non-competes. If you have ever been in a non-compete agreement, forced to sign one as a condition of your employment, you should write a public comment to the FTC saying, you support them in this initiative to get rid of this wage suppression tactic. And that opportunity will be replicated in every kind of rule that is made down the line. So, there's a place called regulations.gov. I'm not sure it's a super well-trafficked site, but it probably should be, because in the absence of the people using their voice, you only get special interest voices. Right. And so I think that's a great opportunity for people to get involved, even beyond, signing petitions or going to protests or things like that. Those, if regulators see real people expressing their view and supporting them, that really does make a difference.
Great. Well, it's a great summary. I appreciate that. Again, my guest is David Dayen, executive editor of the American Prospect, which can be found at prospect.org. So, David, as always, thanks for the great work. And as always, thanks for coming on the program.
All right. Thank you very much.
And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.